Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on the channel today. I'm Ted Yacucci. Well, today I really want to take a close look at Michael Paine and his role in the setup of the assassination of President John Kennedy. Now, you know, I spend an inordinate amount of time really on Ruth Paine because I think her relationship with Lee and Marina Oswald is a linchpin in really understanding the assassination. But Michael Paine was at least as guilty. And you'll see as we go through this video today, I think not only how guilty he was, but you'll see how rehearsed his very brief interview with the Warren Commission really was. And you'll see how careful they had to be in the questions that they asked him and how much they really did not ask him. And that's why his testimony was so short. But before we get to any of that, I want to ask you a question. Okay? I want to ask you a question. Look at this picture. This picture was taken on November 23rd, the morning after the assassination of John Kennedy. And it was taken by Life magazine, and it shows the Paine family sitting around having breakfast early in the morning. And here's the two children of Ruth and Michael Paine. Well, let me ask you a question. If you had two children that were that small, would you allow someone that you think is a defector from the United States, someone who you're going to say is mentally unstable, mean to their wife, and a bunch of other not very complimentary attributes to Lee Oswald? Are you going to allow that person to stay at your house every weekend around your children? I don't think so. And I think we have to look at a lot of common sense when we really examine the whole relationship of Michael Paine, Ruth Paine to the Oswalds. Let's get into it. Now, we've already spent a lot of time in other videos looking at the backgrounds of Ruth and Michael Paine, and we know they both came from extraordinarily wealthy families, and it would be difficult to find two families that had more connections to American intelligence than the families of Ruth and Michael. And as a matter of fact, Alan Dulles, the chief of the CIA, was having an affair with a woman named Mary Bancroft, and they would spend a lot of time at the family compound of Michael Paine. So for Alan Dulles not to recuse himself immediately from the Warren Commission because of all his connections to Ruth and Michael, or at least mention it, even if he didn't recuse himself, is just incredible. And perhaps the most obvious family connection was Sylvia Hoke. Sylvia Hoke was Ruth Paine's sister. She worked for the Office of Naval Intelligence and then the CIA. Ruth Paine spent at least a week and probably two with Sylvia Hoke in Washington, D.C., immediately before leaving to pick up Marina Oswald in New Orleans and take her to Dallas for the 2 months before the JFK assassination. Okay, so we're going to pick up the story from the time that Ruth Paine picks up Marina Oswald in New Orleans and then takes her back to Dallas to live at the Paine household for the 2 months before the assassination. All right, so even though they're supposedly estranged, Michael Paine will come to dinner, according to his words in the Warren Commission, once or twice a week and during the week, and then come pretty much every Friday and spend the weekend there, okay, at the Paine household. Again, even though they're supposedly estranged. Now, Lee Oswald, of course, will come and spend every weekend there also. He'll usually come on Fridays and then go back on Sundays, okay? What the Warren Commission doesn't ask is how much interaction, Michael, did you have with Lee Oswald? Well, we know, of course, that Michael Paine took Lee Oswald during those 2 months. He took him to at least, or I should say, we think it was at least six political meetings, including a John Birch Association, ACLU Association meetings. He took him to all of these meetings, right? So that's one of the first things that you would expect the Warren Commission to ask about. But they don't. They wouldn't have asked Michael Paine about it at all, except that he made a comment about Lee Oswald being with him at a ACLU meeting. So it seems like it was probably rehearsed that they would not bring up any of these meetings, this interaction, this relationship between Michael Paine and Lee Oswald, except Michael Paine kind of blew it. Okay? So here we are in the testimony of Michael Paine from the Warren Commission, and they're trying to get Michael Paine to say that Lee Oswald was very interested in this newspaper called The Worker, which had communist leanings. So he's talking about it, but all of a sudden Michael Paine says, another time at the ACLU, and this talk he had with Frank, or this argument that he had with Frank and a third party on the way home, he asked if I knew that third party and whether I thought he was a communist, and he said he thought he was a communist. And then so I can just imagine the faces of Liebler and the other Warren Commission members that happened to be there, because I'm sure they had talked about not going into any of these meetings. So all of a sudden, they have to ask him a little bit about this ACLU meeting, right? But they don't. And then, of course, the next question is, well, when did you go to this meeting, this ACLU meeting? When did you take Lee Oswald to this meeting? Were there any other interactions that you had, you and Lee Oswald? Well, he'd have to say, well, sure, I went to like 5 or 6 meetings with him. We went to the John Birch Association meeting way over on the extreme right. We went to the ACLU. But they don't ask. They don't ask. The Warren Commission does exactly what they always do when they can't ask a question. They just ignore it. They just go into other things. It's incredible. And that's nothing. I'm going to show you stuff that you're not going to believe. Okay, now we move to the famous backyard photos, supposedly showing Lee Oswald and the Mannlicher Carcano rifle. Well, what we need to remember is that those backyard photos were found during the second search of the Paine household in the garage on Saturday, November 23rd. But what does Michael Paine say about it? He says that he was shown the photos at the Dallas Police Department on Friday night, the day of the assassination. Okay, so we know that the famous backyard photos were found in the Paine garage, but not until a second search was done on Saturday, November 23rd. So how the heck did Michael Paine see them at the Dallas police station on the night of the assassination, November 22nd? Also, we have to remember that Michael Paine was one of the very few people who had visited the Oswald house on West Neely Street in Dallas before they went to live in New Orleans. And he said that he went over there to pick them up, to take them back to dinner at the Paine household. And he spent a half hour or 45 minutes there. And he was very familiar with that Neely Street house. Well, does that all start to make sense? It really begins to give us even more questions about how involved Michael Paine was in the production of those backyard photos, or at the very least, when they were discovered, and we know that he wasn't telling the truth. So now let's take a minute and talk about two incidents that the Warren Commission never asked Michael Paine about, but they're of extreme importance. And the first one was the Dallas police officer, Buddy Walters, of course, reported removing 6 small filing cabinets containing the names of pro-Castro sympathizers from the Paine garage on the afternoon of the assassination. So that was immediately reported by Buddy Wathers and, of course, known by the Warren Commission. So why wasn't Michael Paine asked about that? Well, the reason is, of course, is that even if they brought it up, even if he was going to lie about it, that would have begun to shed light on Ruth and Michael as intelligence agents, or assets, I should say, who were keeping track of pro-Castro sympathizers in the Dallas area. Now, the second incident was the sports drone shooting sightings that there were three of them that took place in the weeks leading up to the JFK assassination. And if you'll remember, there was a shooter supposedly looking exactly like Lee Oswald who was doing crazy things on this shooting range, shooting at other people's targets and doing other things and making himself, of course, very rememberable. The same way that Albert Bogart reported the fake imposter Oswald taking a test drive in the red Mercury Comet and going 85 miles an hour on Stemmons Freeway. All part of that scenario, right? Well, the important thing about the sports drone incidences are that Michael Paine lived very near to that shooting range in Grand Prairie, Texas. Further, there were reports that Michael Paine was seen handing a rifle over the fence to Lee Oswald during one of those instances. All right, now, the Warren Commission obviously knew about all of this because they made a point of writing about it later in the publication before it was published. So the question is, two incidences like that, where you have file cabinets in the garage with pro-Castro sympathizers, and times where the Lee Oswald imposter at the Sportsdrome right next to where Michael Paine is living and is supposedly seen there. Why didn't the Warren Commission at least ask Michael Paine about those? The next item on our list is extremely important, and that's the wiretap that recorded Michael Paine calling Ruth Paine at exactly 1 p.m. on the day of the assassination, November 22nd. And of course, what he said, you probably are familiar with it, was that Lee Oswald would be blamed for the assassination of President Kennedy, but they both knew who was really responsible. And remember, this was before Lee Oswald his name was even out there, before Officer Tippit had been killed, before Lee Oswald had gone to the Texas Theater, all of that stuff, right? This was at 1 p.m. So that wiretap was exceedingly important. So why didn't the Warren Commission ask about the wiretap? Well, again, they couldn't, right? Because it would have led to too much further inquiry after that. But what did they do? They actually tried to get Michael Paine to say that he may have gone to work on Saturday, the next day. And I know what they were getting at there. They were going to try to say that maybe that phone call really didn't happen on the 22nd, but it happened on the 23rd. But Paine wouldn't even say it. He just said, "Oh, I can't remember. I think I spent the night at the house, and of course he did, because he's seen there having breakfast like we saw in that picture, right? And then he says, "Oh, I think I went back to my apartment in Grand Prairie, after that, sometime in the afternoon. I don't remember what I was doing." That was his whole MO during the whole inquiry. He couldn't remember anything. This was in March of 1964, only less than 4 months, I think, actually, after the actual assassination. And he goes through a short testimony saying he can't remember anything. But what the Warren Commission was trying to do was to have him say, "Oh, well, maybe I did go to work on the the 23rd, because then they could place the wiretap recording on that day. But he didn't do it, and he couldn't do it. Why? Because the Bell Helicopter plant was restricted, and you needed clearance, and everybody that went in there would have had to be recorded, whether you are an employee or a visitor, right? Well, Michael Paine knew this, so he knew he couldn't say that he went to work on the 23rd Saturday, because first of all, he didn't, and could be easily proven that he did not. The next thing I want to touch on quickly is the Imperial reflex camera that supposedly took the famous backyard photos. Well, as you may know, the Paine garage, the whole Paine household, was searched multiple times, of course, over the weekend of the assassination. And there were some bags, some duffel bags, that were searched by two or three Dallas police officers who wrote affidavits about all the things that they searched that day. Well, 2 weeks after the assassination, the Imperial reflex camera shows up in one of these duffel bags, supposedly belonging to Lee Oswald, and of course, reinforces the lone nut story that Lee Oswald did pose for the famous backyard photos. But of course, the problem is that the Dallas police officers had already signed affidavits that no camera was found in that duffel bag, and if there had been one, it would have been taken and confiscated. More than that, all of a sudden, there's a small Minox, what's called a small Minox spy camera that is kind of in flux. First of all, it's said to be a light meter, and that's the story that they're trying to put out. When the Dallas police realizes that, and the FBI realizes that no one's going to believe that's a light meter because too many people have seen it, they say, oh, yeah, it's a Minox spy camera. And it belonged to Michael Paine. And then Ruth goes through this big, long, fake explanation of how she thinks he dropped it in the ocean and it's all rusted and doesn't work. Well, you know what? That's exactly what we're talking about, common sense, right? What would Michael Paine be doing with a Minox spy camera, right? And it just happens to be found. And why is the backyard the Imperial reflex camera found 2 weeks after the assassination when that doggone garage has been searched probably 10 times, right? There's so much more about Michael Paine, that we could include here, and I don't want the video to get too long. If you want to see a part two on this, please just put it in the comments, and I'd be happy to do it. And I do have a lot of videos, of course, on Ruth Paine and the Paines together. So, I hope you'll look at those if you're interested in the Michael and Paine involvement in the setup of the JFK assassination. Thank you so much for being with me here today, and please hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. We'll see you next time.